So welcome to this webinar on why do wind energy projects fail. A story that's a tale of a research project that we started at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick well over a year ago now. Let me start while people are coming in with just the normal housekeeping details we're all familiar with. The webinar is being recorded and we will share the webinar after this webinar is complete. It'll be up on our YouTube channel. If you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to put them into the chat. Our research team is here. Louis Charles Weincourt will be monitoring the chat. Corey Robichaud, who you've heard from through the emails and registration, is here also for support. And he will put into the chat, once we've got everybody in, the links to today's presentation. They were included in the reminder email, but just to make sure. And the presentation is available in both English and French. We are not immune to the reality that we're telling a story today that partly took place in northern New Brunswick, and so we've tried to cover that. I will be speaking in English, however, but Louis Charles is here for answering any questions in the chat in French, as well as once the presentation is over. We would ask that if you keep yourself on mute while we are doing the presentation, and then we'll open it up. And as I said, you are free to enter questions into the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, I'll stop sharing the screen when we get to the end so we can all see each other's lovely faces if you choose to have video off. So why don't I get started, and we'll try to keep the presentation tight and allow for a good amount of time for questions. I will cover a little bit of the background to this research, the literature that we reviewed to help us understand the story, talk about some of the specific wind projects informing this work in New Brunswick, talk very briefly about the method we used, our findings and conclusions and recommendations, and then share next steps. So this is an interesting way to start a research project, first for me, but it started in 2021. I was visiting my cousin in northern New Brunswick, and she was talking to me about some community concern about wind and proposed wind projects in the area. And of course, it doesn't take very long for most people to know that I work on climate change. I am the Director of Climate Change Solutions at the Conservation Council. I've been working in this field for a very long time. And so my cousin basically said, you know, I realize you want lots of renewable energy and you probably don't want to hear from these people in our community. And I was immediately seized by that challenge and said, well, why not? Why wouldn't I listen and learn from what's going on in these communities? And the reason, of course, is failure is not an option when it comes to climate change. And so it did make me ask the research question, why do renewable energy projects fail? The story here in New Brunswick is not a new one, and is likely to be a story that's told over and over again. And so this question did guide a year-long effort that started with an in-depth review of academic literature. We did national focus groups to understand what Canadians think across the country about renewable energy and the kinds of influence they would like to have over projects. And then we did a survey that confirmed our initial findings or disconfirmed it, depending on the questions you're looking at. And then we were in community all summer with two of our researchers doing interviews in the community. So the background to this story, and if you're in another location, another country, you'll have this similar kind of construct in terms of program, but this is what the story was here in New Brunswick. Not the easiest name. It was called the LORESS program, locally owned renewable energy projects that are small scale. It was launched in 2016 by the province and NB Power, looking to procure 80 megawatts of power under the program. Expressions of interest were put out, and over the 2-year period, 2016 and 17, projects were brought forward for consideration under two calls. The first call was looking for projects with Indigenous involvement, Aboriginal businesses, and the second call for the second 40 megawatts was for what they called local entities, so community groups, cooperatives, municipalities, and so on. Of the proposals received, and there were quite a few, I understand almost 100, 4 projects were selected to proceed and were awarded power purchase agreements with MD Power. And only 2 were built. The 2 Indigenous business projects were built. And the 2 projects that had been selected on the community or the local entity side, which happened to be in northern New Brunswick, did not proceed. So what's motivating, and I hinted at this, this research, the reason we're concerned about it and want to pay attention and be humble in terms of considering and listening to people's issues is that we know if we're going to solve climate change, the pace of our solution implementation has to pick up. We've got a very short period of time and a commitment, for example, federally, to have a zero emitting electricity system within 15 years, so by 2035. We're about to see some regulations come from the federal government to support that process. And we know that when you look at modeling with energy modelers and climate plans, there's always this kind of conclusion that electrifying everything is a part of the story of solving climate change. And the proposals are that the electricity system would, can and will likely double, or maybe for some projections, triple in size as we power transportation, homes, and businesses. And so we've got a pace issue and we've got a proportion issue. And then we've got a people issue, because we know at a high level, Canadians, as we see around the world, favor renewable energy, wind, sun, and water. But at the down to the community level with respect to specific projects, we can see opposition. And so in the context of this research, we're trying to understand why, because we would like to see more projects succeed than fail. But let's be serious, I mean, in the sense of, you know, not every project can succeed. Some projects just are inappropriate, no matter how great the engagement of the community is. And so while we are normative, as the academics would say, in the sense of wanting to see success, it's not at any cost and under the full understanding that some projects are just not suitable. The first shocking thing that happened when we started this work, and I think for Louis Charles, maybe not as shocking because he started looking at this for us last summer, but I was stunned to find out that social scientists have been studying this issue around social acceptance, and you'll hear more about community acceptance. They're actually distinct ideas, but they've been doing this work for more than 30 years. And as academics do, they do great research and then do a lousy job of sharing that with practitioners. So I thought what I would do is, and if you are interested in what the academics have been doing, we did include in our study a very, I think, good literature review that we're going to keep expanding. We're at this again for another year of exploration with different academic disciplines. But I'm going to share just 4 of the key insights because they are part of the story we're about to tell, but also because they challenge some of our own biases. The first thing is that there's strong evidence and a consensus that process fairness, so meaning, you know, how we actually communicate and engage people, participation of citizens, and trust can influence acceptance. Well, that shouldn't be a surprise, but it's surprising, you know, how often we don't get the process right. And so a planning process that is perceived as fair can lead to greater tolerance of a project, even when it doesn't satisfy all stakeholders. That process piece turns out to be all important and for a long time. And so more participatory processes may increase trust and support ongoing post-construction stewardship. In this case, they're talking about, you know, once the project's built, the developer, or there should be some body that's still involved engaging the community and communicating with citizens. The big one that I think may surprise you is that social scientists have long discredited this idea of NIMBYism. And that's the idea of not in my background, my backyard, Generally, it's considered to be a selfish motive that people are concerned about their own interests. And the social scientists really have challenged that. They describe it as a discredited idea that's simplistic, pejorative, politically inappropriate, and unhelpful as a framework to explain public attitudes toward wind facilities, both before and after they are built. And nonetheless, the term persists, and I know it persists in the world that I work in among wind industry policymakers and even researchers. Two additional points that are relevant to this work is that the socioeconomic impacts are important. And local stakeholders are concerned with various socioeconomic impacts. So especially if they're living near wind turbines, they want to see benefits that stay in the local community. And they feel a sense of injustice about bearing the burden of costs when consumption of and profits related to the power are enjoyed elsewhere. And this really came up in our work. And then secondly, this question of annoyance. Sound and visual impacts are strongly tied to perceptions of annoyance, feelings of annoyance and opposition. And annoyance and opposition related to the actual or expected sound and visual impacts are documented, well documented. And in some cases, annoyance and other impacts are ignored, downplayed, or assumed to be absent or inconsequential by developers and policymakers. And we can think about it ourselves, how we may dismiss some of the things that are raised by citizens. And I think this research tells me, just right off the top, before we even got into our own case study, that we need to check our own natural tendency to be defensive or biased when we're trying to make something happen. So how is this literature actually structured? And it's important because I think we also like to be general in our thinking. We're talking about the general idea of social acceptance, but the academics actually have a lot more to say about this in a more nuanced way that I really found helpful. And so there's three kinds of elements to broad concept of social acceptance. So there's socio-political acceptance, and that covers things like market and community aspects, acceptance of the technologies generally and the policies. The LORESS program, for example, which was positively received, is very much in that socio-political acceptance context. Then there's market acceptance, which relates to whether consumers accept the technologies, whether investors are ready and willing to play, whether the markets are there for the sale and purchase of the renewable energy power. And then there's community acceptance, which relates to citizens' perceptions of process fairness. So in academics terms, procedural justice, the community benefits aspect, which is distributional justice, and trust. And this case study very much is focused on that third element, the community acceptance piece of the broader idea of social acceptance. Now, I mentioned some terms that academics like to use, like procedural and distributive and recognition justice, but to people, we're really in a world that's thought through as fairness. And when people are evaluating a project, when they're evaluating a policy, I've seen this in my own long-term research around things like carbon pricing and so on. Fairness is the lens through which people evaluate how they're going to respond to something. And the distributional side, so the sharing of burdens and benefits, has 6 elements. If you look here, you'll just see there's fairness comparison on the left that's got 3 broad categories: intrapersonal, meaning compared to myself; interpersonal, meaning comparison to other folks, and within the current generation, so people around me, my neighbors, and so on. And then intergenerational comparisons in terms of the future. And in terms of fairness outcomes, there's kind of 6 distributional outcomes here. Am I going to be worse off financially than somebody else? Personally, am I going to be worse off? Am I going to be worse off compared to others? Am I going to be equally affected? Is it fair, proportional to income? So we see a lot of concerns about, for example, impacts of policies on low-income households. Is it proportional to the contribution to the problem? For example, are big polluters doing their fair share? And for those folks who are motivated by environmental concerns, they're thinking about, is it going to actually be effective for and future generations? So let me just give you a little bit of information now with that background from how academics have been looking at this in more precise detail. Give you some bit of precision, and I'm not going to read you obviously this whole table. These are all, of course, in the report. But there were 4 projects, 2 in the north of New Brunswick that I've mentioned, one in a community called Pokeshaw, another in a community called Anse-Bleue. And then 2 First Nation projects that, as we mentioned, were different in structure. So the Nuktuk and the Woodstock First Nation projects. And each of these were differently constructed in terms of partnerships. The Northern New Brunswick partners were private developers that had community partners, but not in the same way that the Indigenous projects did, because the Indigenous projects had equity partnerships and the Northern New Brunswick projects didn't. I think it's a factor, but the projects were all the same in terms of size, really, 20 megawatts each. These are small projects relative to some of the sizes you might have heard about with respect to hydrogen. You know, we're talking hundreds of megawatts for some of these projects, but these were 20 megawatts, 18 megawatts in the case of Woodstock. So similar in size, but different structure. And interestingly, also 4 projects, but 6 locations. And so the 2 projects in Northern New Brunswick proposed by private developers were actually going to be located in or near in Pokeshaw and Anse-Bleue. But the 2 Indigenous projects were actually located about quite a ways away. I think it's 3 hours away if I have my memory here, in a location that had a better wind regime and where we already have some wind turbines located. And so there was this distance element that could also be a factor. But again, it's hard to know if that locational issue was the real trick in the context of the North. We think there were other issues that were more important. I mentioned that we did focus groups and surveys to learn about how people approach it, and then we use that information that we learned to structure some interviews. We talked to 19 people in the 2 communities, 13 citizens, 2 community leaders, 4 developers, and excitingly, from my perspective, 9 of the interviews in French and 6 in English. So just to our findings. As is often the case, there were concerns about the specific environmental elements of the project, the effects that the projects would have on the environment. But there were also health and economic concerns. So none of these will surprise you. They're the common issues that are raised and often shared community to community in terms of opposition to projects. So concerns about birds and water contamination from oil in the gearboxes and light impacting wildlife, concerns about the lynx population, marine fauna, and earthworms. But on the health side, noise, shadow flicker, maintenance once the project was underway, groundwater concerns, the location was a big issue, and this will come up in terms of our results, that the siting of the project, particularly in Anse-Bleue, was a challenge. And then on the economic side, not sure about the community benefit offers and whether they were adequate, who was going to be responsible for cleanup after the fact, after the projects were over, should anything go wrong, concerns about whether there's a loss of value in property values, and that there wasn't a lot of significant job creation. Just to let you know, this is also an area that academics have looked at. The literature, for example, is mixed on this question of whether there's loss of value in property values. Some studies say absolutely not. Some studies say maybe. So it's worth noting that these issues are being looked at and should be looked at. And we may not always get answers that corrects for maybe misinformation. It may in fact be a real issue. But what really stood out was that the real story here in terms of these projects and projects, I think anywhere where you see a lot of opposition, is that trust, fairness, and community benefits were central themes in the interviews, consistent with the research, and it falls into these 6 kind of categories. First of all, distrust or mistrust is powerful. And once that door is open, it's a spiral. There were and continue to be missteps in community engagement and communication, failure to consider community literacy and language issues, a lack in this case of a community entity to negotiate with, inflexibility and lack of involvement from MB Power, according to the people we interviewed, and unfair distribution of costs and benefits. We'll go through those each, just one slide each to talk about that. So in the case of this power of distrust, what happened here was there was, of course, a competitive process in terms of the expressions of interest and the solicitation and the issuance of the power of purchase agreements. And the developers, while they didn't have to do it this way, chose not to engage the communities prior to knowing they had the power of purchase agreement. Now think about that. That means the project is fairly well down the road. You've already been through probably several rounds of negotiation with MB Power. You've signed a contract, and now you go to a community and tell them that, oh, isn't this great news? We're going to do this project here. That process did include some engagement of landowners that would be affected by the project, but not the broader community, and that turned out to be a mistake. And of course, that failure to engage citizens early just really haunted, particularly in Anse-Bleue, the project right to the end. And the academics call this the decide, announce, and defend approach, and suggest that we might want to move instead to a process that's focused on consultation, engagement, and collaboration. And we heard in quotes over and over and over again that you know, the first time that anybody heard about the project was when they announced that the project was going to be built, and that simply didn't sit with people. On the power of distrust, the siting issue came up over and over again, particularly in Anse-Bleue, where they felt the proposed project was too close to home. And there was just this inability to get a conversation going with MB Power and the developer and the community that would have identified a community location that was more suitable. And so that combination of feeling betrayed at the beginning and then feeling uninformed as the process went on, just and unable to influence the siting issue, really kept coming back in these conversations. And also this point that people would always feel a bit ashamed and embarrassed to say, you know, I feel badly that I'm opposed to this project because I'm not against wind turbines in general, that we need renewable energy. And there was always that kind of qualification, you know, we're trying to convince people we're not just not NIMBYism here, right? That we have real issues and we want to be involved. In terms of missteps, it might be unique in this particular context. But you know, it is the case that Anse-Bleue in particular is a francophone community, and the environmental impact assessment was an English-only document. They had to translate it themselves. This was very difficult for them. That also undermined trust, of course. But we also had some people that were satisfied with the information shared, particularly in Pokeshaw. They seemed to be more comfortable with it. They did speak more English, and so they had more capacity to deal with the material that was being shared. But one of the key things that surprised me, that's not a surprise when you think about it, but that it was brought up and then I had to absorb it, is that when information changes over time, when it's not consistent, that also undermines trust. And it was the case. You have this quote here, you know, from one of the Anse-Bleue residents. Many people didn't trust the information provided because it changed constantly. The prices, the size of the windmills, the megawatts plan, and specifically where the windmills would be located. The places were treated like a secret. Also, the reports and evaluations were not disclosed. The literacy question and language is also something that was important here. I mentioned the language issue, but it was also the case that the communities included citizens that were older, somewhat less educated than, say, the average, And so some of the information was just difficult to understand. I mean, it's very legalistic. And the developer, I think, tried very hard to do something about helping the community evaluate projects. They paid for a third-party francophone lawyer to help review documents and explain to the landowners. They went door to door and tried to have one-on-one conversations. But the challenge was, because trust had been undermined at the beginning, the developer, who had paid for the lawyer as a gesture, the result of that was that the person wasn't trusted. And that leads to one of our recommendations about neutral agencies being created that can assist communities with evaluation that isn't developer led. This is unique perhaps to New Brunswick, but there were, in this case, we have a lot of unincorporated communities, meaning that they're not, they don't have a municipal government to deal with. And that led to, in the case, for example, of Anse-Bleue, actually the partner was in Bathurst, which was a community 40-some minutes away. And so that was a problem. It's not going to be a problem everywhere, but and not always for New Brunswick, because we've resolved that to some degree through some recent amalgamations. Now, I just want to be fair here to, these are comments coming from the interviewees, right? And so it's very interesting to me, the perceptions that people had about MB Power, because it shows me that MB Power was an institution that was trusted and that was actually important to people's evaluations of the projects. In terms of how LORESS was working, the 4 projects were being handled by the developers and their community partners, and MB Power was the purchaser, but otherwise unengaged. And that led to a lot of difficulties in the community. They felt that there was a lack of public commitment to renewable energy generally in the community, like no open houses. There were questions that people had and they couldn't get answers from MB Power. And that communication vacuum extended to not being told, in the case of Anse-Bleue, that the project would not proceed. That only happened last June when our own researchers were going door to door. And so you'll see these comments that, you know, this one from Pokeshaw, I'm very disappointed with MB Power, I'll tell you that, to not give an extension of 9 months. This was a factor that people perceived an inflexibility by the utility. I'm not saying it's fair or that it's absolutely correct. I'm simply saying how it was perceived. There was an interest in seeing the projects proceed to some degree, particularly in Pokeshaw or in another location, as I mentioned. They wanted to see opportunities for contract timelines to be extended. There were some concerns about supply chain and COVID, you know, that kind of thing. And people felt there was just either misinformation, no information, or not enough flexibility on the part of MB Power, depending on who you were, and put them in, I think, a bit of a bind. And so there was also this question, and I'll just read the bottom row there. Also real issues around a distribution of costs and benefits. And this is where the recommendation comes back. You'll see at the end here where I talk about the need for a neutral agency. Because one of the big problems was that each of these 4 projects had different community benefits agreements. In the case of the Indigenous projects, the Tobique project is more public than the Woodstock one, but it's in this vein. You know, they had a 51% equity position, and so they're generating $800,000 to over $1 million a year going into a community fund that's supporting infrastructure and housing and important things the community needs to do. In the 2 projects in the north, there was a $10,000 donation early in 2007 as the early discussions were happening. The Anse-Bleue project talked about a tourist booth and an ATV bike trail. And one of the key questions that the public asked, the citizens asked in the interviews, was, how did we know that these were fair offers? How do we evaluate what is appropriate? What is best practice when it comes to community benefits? And often what we found, not just in these projects, but in other research that we did, is the developers are focusing on the landowners and lease arrangements. And the challenge there is those are done, obviously, in confidence. And that created a us and them kind of dynamic in the communities. And so you want those community benefit agreements, I think, to balance out what's happening on the landowner side. In a small community like the 2 we're talking about, it has generated some real bitterness. So let me just conclude with what we came away with from these interviews. The first thing was These interviews were highly emotional. Our two researchers came back also feeling fairly emotional about what they had heard. There were tears in the interviews, and so the legacy is long, and it's a concern for sure in terms of the Conservation Council's work and our climate work. We can't afford to have these kinds of outcomes in projects if we're going to actually solve climate change and get to a place where we've got an efficient and renewable electricity. Interviewees were agitated, and this was 2 years after the projects actually ended. We've got the Anse-Bleue wind developer actually is taking the city of Bathurst to court because they walked away at some point when the opposition was strong. And so we do think that our big conclusion, it's no surprise to anybody that's done this kind of work, that more inclusive models are needed, and that we do need to be deeply engaged around this question of community acceptance, and that involves early engagement and community benefits, equity partnership agreements, as well as the best practice around community-oriented projects. So on that basis, let me take you quickly through the recommendations. No surprise, consult host communities early about proposed renewable energy projects, provide where feasible opportunities to indicate a preference for project siting. And this really came up in our focus groups, where some participants were located in communities where developers, obviously within the realm of it's a good wind regime, but would say, these 2 or 3 sites work from our economic perspective, which ones work best for you. And that kind of process, where it's possible, I think can be helpful. Waiting until power purchase agreements have been secured to start consulting probably is clearly, in this case anyway, too late. Conflict over proposed siting clearly is setting off a chain reaction that we simply want to avoid. And so negotiating landowner leases without community engagement is going to create tensions. It seems to be a case in our province under the LORESS program, maybe in other locations. It's not as big an issue, but it certainly was here because it did create perception of winners and losers. The second recommendation is that utilities, local governments, and provinces should be playing a legitimizing and supportive role. And this is where I'm thinking about an independent office, and whether it's a renewable energy office. Some states have a siting commission or a siting office that's negotiating these details. But that, there should be some place for citizens to go to get information, to help them think things through that have nothing to do with the government or utility supporting or a particular project, but is about the general ideas of renewables and what they are and the issues. Utilities and government can facilitate with up-to-date best practice guidelines regarding siting and community benefits agreements. I looked for something like that in Canada. I found one in Australia. We need a guide to community engagement for developers, and we need, I think, an office of renewable energy that would provide that general, but in our context locally, and I say culturally relevant information, whether that's on the Indigenous side or the Francophone, Anglophone side. We need those best practice guidelines. The other thing that we could do here is have a better sense of the best locations in New Brunswick for location of wind projects. That is a public thing that has involved a process where people can engage. Might not solve everything, but it does allow for us to have a conversation prior to specific projects. I do think that there needs to be benchmarks set for community benefits. As I said, the citizens have difficulty evaluating, and I think that's something that a government office can do. And the real interesting aspect of the academic literature is there's a whole other world out there of academics in the technology sphere that study the cycles of technology implementation and have identified, we've heard it, we talk about it, that there is in fact a hype and buzz phase, and that we should be careful about that. In order to really promote a project, we kind of hype it up, but the reality is that it can lead to skepticism. And in the case, as I mentioned earlier, what it means is as reality hits and comes to bear, the project outline and details will change, and then people are undermining the developers are under money trust in the sense of having to change those details. And so a little bit of control over how much hype and buzz there is relative to where we think things might end up could be good. And I think governments should publish and regularly update on the best practice community benefits guidelines as an ongoing thing, not just do it once. The idea of community benefits is a lot more complex as well as I got into this and as we did the research, and includes many different things like utility bill rebates. New York has that. Sometimes property taxes are reduced and that leads to benefits for householders. There's lots and lots of experience out there that we could bring to bear to whatever we do in the future in New Brunswick or in the region or Canada or globally on renewable energy. This issue of misinformation is really an issue that needs to be dealt with. This is not to say that information that turns out to be, not true is a problem. It's just that when people, one academic calls it the PASTA method, when people are concerned about a project and they're trying to evaluate whether they're going to live with this or not, and they've got discomforts, they'll be grabbing a lot of information and, as this one academic calls it, just throwing the pasta on the wall, seeing which ones stick. And so it's important to have good information, neutral information, but also to respect that information alone is not going to be the total solution to community support. Sometimes, as I say, it's more that it's trust, and information alone can't help. But information, in the absence of information, we really have a problem. And so information should be available, it should be neutral, and the precautionary principle should apply. If there are concerns and we don't have all the information, like on property values or on water issues, we should be careful and not to be dismissive of people, but we should look at what we can do. And I think that unbiased piece has been mentioned a few times. So just let me conclude by sharing with you this video that we've done that kind of summarizes the entire report and gives you the story simply, and it's available, of course, in English and French, but here you'll see the English. So let me stop sharing now and just let you know that that video is part of a series of videos. I'm just going to make sure my sound is up. Yeah, I think my sound is still up. Is it? I hope so. You can find those on our website. The material's probably in the chat right now. I will open the chat now. And if folks have questions, again, just to maybe set the final context here, that what's critical is, it's a study. We've done some things, we've learned some things. There will always be challenges and issues, but I think we can put ourselves on better footing with thinking about some of the dynamics that we picked up in our research. So thank you. So let me go over, I see a hand up, Environmental Transparency Project. Let's just do that. And then I'll let Elsie tell me about anything in the chat. Do you want to maybe just go?
Yep. Hi, how are you?
Well, thank you.
I'm just from, we are from Cape St. George, Newfoundland, and we are involved in the Rural Energy GH2 project proposed here in Newfoundland. And we have been, I guess, informed since June about the proposal. And as you were stating, and with trust within the company, and we have not gained that trust so far. Right now, the Met Towers are commencing here now, and we have a lot of concerns about the how the project is already, I guess, has not been approved through Crown Lands yet. And we're still waiting for the EIS assessments to come in, and we are waiting on that as well. But with all this, I guess, construction going on with just the Met towers, just to get the wind, I guess, speeds here in Newfoundland, it's already a concern because we are already experiencing the lack of information, lack of permits we're seeing. We are going to the sites and we are investigating. We are our own investigators here because of of all the construction going on, and knowing has any answers, because there's a lot of people are concerned. Their water supply is also affected here now in one of the areas where they're putting up Met Tower. We are going to the government, we are going to the MHAs, we're going to the company, and it seems like we're not getting the proper people to come in and to guide us or to guide the people, because there's no one from the government here standing beside us and watching this project. Is it going to be here? We don't know. It's just in a process of, like I said, under environmental guidelines and that. And we are just a small organization here that we had set up, some of us, to come out and actually give information to the people on the Port-au-Port area here, because there is the information is choked here. We
Yep.
don't feel that the information is going out to the people. We had to come up, look into their proposal, and we had to put out all the information, what we can find. And, as you say, misinformation. We are not getting any information that's not coming from the company. And we're always asking them to come to meetings. They have meetings in the areas, but what's the problem is that they're, I guess the meetings is to ask for questions. We have questions, but they don't have answers at those meetings.
Yeah.
And this is where so frustrating for us, because there's always no plans. There's no plans. And right now, the water's being affected. The ground is going into, they are doing construction. They put up a Met Tower. All the construction they're going on the roads is going in a water supply. So right now, we have a water supply out here onto the area of mainland, and they are experiencing ground all underwater. So the sediments and all that's going in their water, and we're trying to get into the departments of the government here, and it seems like we have closed doors everywhere that we go. And the media here is, I mean, we've been trying. We're getting so much of our stories out there, and we are very anxious and concerned. We are stressed, and we don't know where to go from here, because right now, like we had Indigenous leader Brendan Mitchell, which we had to go down last Saturday, and we had to do did a small protest, and he was there for the vets at the time for their status, and we respected the meeting, and we were asked to, I went in, I spoke to him, and we went in and we spoke. And after the meeting, we all got together in the building, and, from the Indigenous point of view, and, here on the Port-au-Port, we are finally recognized as being Mi'kmaq, but we feel that our rights are just overwalked here. And,
Yep.
Some of the leaders, already signed the MOU agreement to this project. And, we feel at loss, because where are our leaders to be protecting the environment here, and especially us people? We have 4,000 people here strong onto the Port-au-Port, and we have 164 wind turbines, industrial, 654-foot turbines coming here, which was never put on land. And we are we are in the surrounding area of it. So they're going to take 40% of our land, and that's a lot. And we right now are experiencing, just with the construction, already affecting the water. And this is just the beginning. So where do we go from here? We have no one to go to.
So first of all, let me just say, I'm so glad you're here. You've been on my mind, let me say. So what I said at the very beginning, some projects just shouldn't happen. This is just to give context for folks on the webinar who may not know about this project. This is a proposal, 164 turbines in the Port-au-Port Peninsula for hydrogen production and export. And the community was not informed. This was literally announced. It was all brought up through the visit of German Chancellor Scholz as part of the doing our war duty. And so this is an industrial project. It is an enormous industrial project. And when I started the webinar by saying some projects shouldn't proceed, this is one of them that I think is very much falls into that category. Because first of all, the scale of it, the lack of community participation in it, but also the fact that people are willing to accept projects when the process is right, when the community benefits and the distribution of benefits and burdens is fair, but also when it's for power in their province. When the first big thing out of the gate is for export, it makes it even more difficult for people to accept that this is the burden that we should carry. And so, first of all, I'd like to follow up with you after the webinar and see what we can do to support it. I do think that it's critically important that this research that we've been doing get to your municipal council. I think they owe it to the community that this is not just an economic development story. This is an ecological story more than it is an economic development story. Somebody's going to get rich, but it's not going to be the community. So I hear you on this lack of information. It would be great if we could collaborate together on this advocacy effort to get neutral information to the communities, to help communities come to terms with these projects. And I think one of the ways that we can do this is perhaps through lobbying the federal government. So maybe there's an opportunity there, but it would be wonderful to follow up. I'm sorry, I don't have a ready-made answer for you. I know what you're going through. It touches my heart because I know what we also found with the communities in Northern New Brunswick. It may also bring some comfort to you to connect with those people. We'd be happy to connect you with some of the people that were in Pokeshaw and Anse-Bleue. But for now, let's make sure that we have your contact information. If you can put it in the chat, Corey will save that and we'll follow up. Okay.
Okay, thank you for your time. Okay. And like I said, this is just the beginning for us, and we really need help in trying to figure out how to proceed, because we feel that our human rights here is not even being heard.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you.
So I see 4 hands up, and then I think let's see what LC can share from the chat. If we could be as efficient as we can, we're happy to let the webinar go a little bit past 2, but we also are respectful of your time. So I'll start with Doris from Renewables MB, and then Steve, and then Joel, and then Mike.
Est-ce que je peux poser mes questions et mes commentaires en français? Sinon, je vais le faire en anglais, mais un peu...
Okay, so LC, you're on deck.
OK, ben, je vais le faire en anglais. OK. J'ai lu avec beaucoup d'intérêt tout le rapport, pas seulement le résumé, mais tout le rapport. Et puis, il y a une question que je me posais, c'est que when you talk about the triangle there, about the social acceptance framework, is this, are you suggesting or recommending that this framework be included in the environmental study criteria by that the government has?
That's a great idea. I mean, I think certainly what we're suggesting is that projects not receive any government funding if there's any support, whether it's a tax benefit or other kinds of supports, that the issuing of a project for the power purchase agreement, when they are evaluating projects, the one suggestion that came to us from developers is that a large amount of the points, when they're doing evaluations of project proposals, they award points by category. And that more points should be awarded to developers for best practice community engagement. And so that framework could be part of the guidance to developers that says this is the basic level of what we expect. And, you know, if you score well on this, you get this many points. If you don't, you're going to get fewer points. You have less chance of success. We've got to make it in their economic interest to do the proper community engagement.
And my second question, now that we have the full municipality in New Brunswick, les commissions de services régionaux, the regional service commission, okay, could they be more implied, okay, as to, you know, could they, with the population, with the communities, could they elaborate, okay, where these wind park could be situated in this, in a certain region, okay, then you know, once that would be settled, it would be easier.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there's two things there. You know, the regional service commissions have land use planning responsibilities, so it could be part of that process. But the province is also committed in its most recent climate plan to developing a clean electricity strategy. And that strategy could also include, you know, consideration of sites that where there's community support for projects. This is like we're talking very early consultation, like well before a specific project comes in. So absolutely, it could be something that is included in the planning component of the regional service commissions. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Steve?
Yes, thank you. Merci.
Thank you for the presentation very much, and I appreciate all the work you're doing. My question is kind of related to this, but not directly related to this. And it has struck me as curious driving across Ontario and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and being sensitive to a lot of the backlash to wind projects, why so many wind projects are essentially in high visibility community areas, as opposed to exploiting other areas that may be as viable, have good access to hydro corridors, but are essentially out of sight. And I realize Crown land has a lot of complications to what that represents, especially for Indigenous people, but it may also represent opportunity in terms of collaboration engagement. But in your work, do you have an insight as to why, as a first priority, effectively out of sight lands that are already exploited by forest companies and mineral companies and other things are not being used for this purpose?
Great question. So what we did learn was, in fact, that all four of the developers could have applied for access to Crown land to do their projects. And the Indigenous projects did apply. And apparently it's not that complicated a process. And so they could have applied, they could have located their projects on Crown land. And that's clearly something that should and could be done. In fact, this issue of what you see does have an influence on acceptance. The closer you are, the more that those community benefit agreements really matter, that kind of thing. The more distant they are, it turns out it's more of a symbolic understanding, and people think of it more in terms of climate change or whatever. It's very fascinating. But the two northern projects chose not to do that. So I can't know exactly what the reasons were. I do know in the Anse-Bleue project, there was a site that was accessible in terms of, you know, being available and seemed to be key to what this developer thought was easy to do. But in the end, it wasn't easy to do. And once the power purchase agreement was signed, then it was difficult to change. And so, yes, I do think, and I do note in the report that, and with a link to the process and the application for applying to Crown, to use and access Crown land. So you've hit on exactly one of the points that we did identify as an opportunity. Yeah. Yeah. Joel. You're just coming off mute.
Micro, Joel.
Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, just a quick point, since I've been looking to, just graduated as a business student, and I've been looking into different energy projects and trying to figure out where to get a job. And I'm thinking I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to some of the Newfoundland stuff if it wasn't so based on trying to distribute into hydrogen, just the logistics of trying to convert something from one energy form to another, to a third, and then back again doesn't make sense in terms of efficiency. But I just wanted to point out that if for some reason half or a bunch of those towers get built and they don't actually end up being used, or the thing with the Germans falls through when whatever Ukraine's resolves, or whatever happens with that, even if that doesn't end up totally working, you at least have all these wind turbines, which could be used for other purposes and actually give energy to the local grid. So it's not necessarily as bad as it may have at first appear, as far as just because of the way it was set up. So it
Absolutely.
could potentially be turned around.
Yeah.
There's the possibility of doing it at either a smaller scale, or trying to figure out ways to make it better without necessarily having to cancel the thing entirely. Anyway, just a quick point.
No, absolutely. And this question of hydrogen, what it will be used for, how much demand there's going to be, this issue of conversion efficiencies. I mean, we should be using the electricity.
Yeah, I mean,
for electricity.
just the fact that they're trying to fix the hydrogen for the process of shipping it, they want to turn it into ammonia, which is not the best thing in terms of environmental. I mean, what if it's very unlikely that a given tanker is going to crash or whatever, but ammonia is not all that much better than oil when you introduce it to water. So
exactly. Yeah. So so that I can get to the other questions, but you know, one of the key things here that I think we should commit to is, you know, just core principles. And one is, we don't solve climate change at the expense of biodiversity and conservation. I mean, we've got to advance our solutions in ways that can not just achieve our objectives to citizens' rights and Indigenous rights and those kinds of things. But there's no excuse for trading off biodiversity. And from what I understand about the location here, this is a very pristine area. And so this is a consideration that has to come into play. And why we need, you know, let's have a social conversation. Let's talk about our priorities and how we are going to accommodate an electricity system that has to grow. What are the best locations? What is it that people want to see? I mean, that's part of this challenge, as opposed to throwing out projects one at a time. We need a better approach here. Mike, and then Duran, and then we'll see what's in the chat.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you for the presentation, for you and your team. I learned a lot here on this today. I'm chair of a group called Coastal People Resource Protection Group. We're focused primarily at this stage in what we do on the ocean's biodiversity and you know, maintaining that kind of conservation activities and sustainable wise use and things like that. So I only became aware, really, even though I live in Newfoundland and Labrador, of the Port-au-Port Peninsula difficulties. And I would suggest to Elsie, he probably knows this better than I do, that the problem is out of sight, out of mind, because it's not a topic here in the capital city where I reside. And but this is a done deal. You know, this is got to bear in mind that this is a multi-billion-dollar Canada's environment, you know, a commitment to the environment, sustainable energy. It's tied into commitments to the United Nations under COP15 that's on the go right now. So there's going to be all kinds of money, and true Aboriginal, First Nation people, it's all going to be in there. So this is big time. It's easy just to kick the small people aside. Without belaboring it too much, I look forward to establishing communications with Elsie and other groups that'll be on the go there. But bear in mind that these are just old little Boy Scouts and Scout girls and that we're taking on. I wouldn't be surprised to hear monitoring us today. These are big dollars. And they have trolls. I've been listening to them phone into the open line programs, things like that. So yep. I look forward to getting involved, and thank you so much.
You're welcome. I just want to say I look forward to my first meeting with Mr. Risley. I've already asked him to reach out. I am keen to have a conversation with him and keen to bring this story, because I think the goal here is to find ways for projects to proceed that should proceed, that really help us with our goals, but not this way. And I think that's the key thing here. Duran?
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
Hi, I've been listening in and out of the meeting because of the fact I had an ongoing appointment at the same time. So I may be rehashing something that's already been brought up. What I would like to know is, how do you go about engaging a company that refuses to be engaged? Like in this case, World Energy GH2, where they tout that they are there for the communities, they're open, they are transparent. Yet in the case of Port, where the Environmental Transparency Committee have set up several meetings, community meetings, and invited GH2, along with some politicians, even our local mayors. And to all of these, we've only had one politician attend, and every meeting that's come up, GH2 does not send anyone. As a matter of fact, I sent in a recommendation to their liaison in Stephenville that they attend this meeting to get some idea. And about 20 minutes before it was scheduled to come on, I get an email from them going, sorry, we're unable to attend. We have a conflicting meeting. And I'm thinking, like, 20 minutes before this? You know, what's on the go? And they have a tendency of dismissing local concerns. The groups that have been formed, they will refer to as fear mongers, feeding misinformation and whatnot. However, I spent over 32 years in the military in the signal side of things, intelligence, and part of my job was I know everything about the RF spectrum from VLF all the way to UHF and above, and the effects it has on various organisms. Apart from that, I also conducted open source research in preparation of report for various government agencies. And so it was critical that we made sure that the information was correct, up to date, and verifiable. Now, we have instances where information has been put out, like World Energy keeps saying, well, if you want truthful information, if you want factual information, go to our website. But their website just has generic questions and generic answers. Nothing to deal with the nitty-gritty of what's going on. And what's truly concerning for the people here is the fact that, pardon the use of the term, they are a virgin company. They only formed in June, July, and they have never, ever done any type of project at all, like nothing. And they're sinking their teeth into something this technically complicated with no experience.
No, absolutely. So a couple of things. I do think that there are some avenues here, and I wouldn't underestimate the power of engagement, because I think there's a common agreement. I'm presuming that everybody on the call would agree we should solve climate change.
Yes.
Right. So and I'm just watching the time. Just give me a sec. And so because there's this common kind of interest, I think that if we can agree that we do need to find solutions, that renewable energy is part of that. What's up for debate here is how that happens, and the important need for people to be fairly engaged. There are avenues. Advocacy is more powerful than we give it credit for. It's not just our opportunity to deal with the media, but the NGOs that we've been working with at the Conservation Council are connected in Canada and internationally to Europe and directly into Germany. And I think that one aspect here is a process of ensuring that the Germans know about the community concerns about the project. So again, with Elise and maybe Steve or others, we can follow up after and talk about those opportunities. But I think that in this case, that the potential purchaser has an obligation to hear from the community. So I think just in terms of I've been at this climate change game for 30 years, and okay, fine, we haven't totally won everything, but my view of it is don't underestimate our power. We can do things, and if we come together, we can, I think, do a lot more. I've been trying to scan the chat. We're about 4 minutes after 2, so I'm going to wrap it up. But is there anything that people feel that was in the chat? I think we've covered everything, but in case, just maybe one last one before we sign off. And Corey will send out the recording as well. So by all means, please share this. It'll be up on our YouTube, and all of that will be available to you. If you would like us to do presentations in your community on the results of our research, don't hesitate to reach out. We're committed to this project. We're continuing to work again this year to expand our analysis, and so we'll be ready to do more. I'll leave the last question to Danielle.
Hi, sorry, I'm dark. I'll try to summarize. I had 2 questions in the chat. One was referring to the RFP process for the power purchase agreements through either NB Power or the province. Is there any way to work with the province or advocate to the province to have that community engagement included within the RFP process so that it has to happen before the award happens?
That's a great question. So before we released this report, I met with the CEO of NB Power and the VP of Planning, which we do. And so they understood what our work had been about, and it's very much the case that we talked about this question of having extra points, and there'll be follow-on meetings. NB Power is looking to do a new recruitment, if you will, of renewables, a new procurement, and very much we'd like to influence how that RFP is structured. Yeah, for sure.
And just quickly, one of the thoughts that I had, is there any way, do you know if governmentally there's anyone looking at determining the social capital of different areas around the province? Because in my mind, if we could determine social capital of different areas and cross that with like wind availability, then we might be able to like more strategically target some of these areas where that trust is already ingrained within the community.
Yeah, that is exactly the process that's been followed in some communities or states, provinces, and so on, where you need to actually look at the whole thing, and that should come out of our clean electricity strategy process, right? Where we're looking at this, we're actually engaging with communities, we're identifying what they have and what the issues might be or the opportunities, and that's the opportunity that we have. But yeah, it's not to say that it's going to solve all problems, but it sure as heck would open the door to a better chance.
Because it certainly seems like qualitatively, or at least by looking, First Nations communities have much more of a success in implementing these projects because they have such a strong sort of social capital within their community to be able to like trust their leaders in order to make the right decisions. So it just seems like maybe we could kind of look at some of those success stories and try to implement them in sort of the Western society.
Yeah, a big part of that is early engagement, equity partnerships with strong recycling of those revenues to the community. I mean, those are big parts of it, right? So absolutely.
Perfect. Thanks.
This was fabulous. Thank you so much for joining today and for being patient to stay until a little bit of extra time. And if you need anything and want us to, as I say, to present anywhere, just let us know. We're happy to do it. Thank you. Bye.